Ukraine is one of the countries hit hardest by the global economic crisis. As the president of U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, how would you assess the Ukrainian government's effort in dealing with this crisis?
The Ukraine government actually has handled this crisis pretty well. Given the political crisis that we know is out there, they've done pretty well. They moved quickly to get an agreement with the International Monetary Fund. That slowed down a little, but it looks like it's going to be back on track. The National Bank did make some rather dramatic moves and let the currency adjust like it needed to. They've now worked out a $500 million loan for some infrastructure development with the World Bank, and hopefully there will be more. So all in all, our members give them pretty good marks for handling this crisis. The crisis hit so quickly. It was so fast. It was so deep. It went so far. It was just shocking that for an emerging market like Ukraine, it was a difficult situation. But I know Dr. Eddie Segura with the Sigma Blazer Group and Anders Oshlund, everybody thinks actually they've done pretty well. There's some more things that they can do, but as long as they get this IMF agreement back on track, then everybody gives them pretty high marks for what they've done.
Was it possible to avoid such a downturn?
No, absolutely not. It was not possible. Ukraine was like a tsunami, I guess. It just kind of rolled over Ukraine. Ukraine was somewhat vulnerable. Prices were being inflated. They had inflation. They had not adjusted the value of their money. They had a lot of borrowings from outside of Ukraine in hard currency. And so they were the economy was heated up, overheated in a sense. So they were vulnerable, but they didn't cause this thing, and they didn't need it. It just rolled over them, and when values around the world went down, of course, they got caught in it, particularly people who had floated IPOs on London or Warsaw or someplace and others. So no, there was no way they could have avoided this.
But Ukraine, was hit the hardest. The Ukraine end up in the worst situation than other countries. Why that happened?
Well, partly because Ukraine is a large country and they have 47 million people, and they really caught on with investors after the Orange Revolution. All your Ukrainian banks moved in there. You had developed a stable middle class. The middle class had some borrowing power now because they had wages, and so they were borrowing for consumer goods, and money was flowing to Ukraine. And so they were really taking off, and at a certain part of their economic development, this thing hit, and so they were particularly vulnerable, and it hit hard, which is to be understood because of where they were in their economic development, with huge inflows of capital the last few years, and with some of the other issues they had, like the value of their currency. Yeah, they were vulnerable, and they got hit harder than most countries.
International financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, as you already mentioned, have agreed to support Ukraine to withstand this global economic crisis. What else, in your opinion, should be done to help Ukraine to overcome this crisis?
What does Ukraine need to do now? They need to finish up and get back on track with the IMF. Absolutely essential. The world's major countries are putting more money into the IMF. They're designated the IMF as the major institution to help countries like Ukraine. And so they've got to get back on track. And it looks like at the May meeting of IMF, they will approve another tranche of money for Ukraine. So that's good. Secondly, they need to continue to work with the World Bank. And there's probably more money available from the World Bank for infrastructure development in Ukraine. They need to stay in close touch with the European Development Bank and also the EBRD. They have funds for Ukraine. A lot of times Ukraine lacks good proposals. They lack good proposals that they can fund. They need to make sure that they offer those good proposals. Then there's a lot of structural reforms that they haven't made yet, which would make the business climate an easier place, a more business-friendly place. And last but not least, they need to solve this problem with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation from the United States. because the United States Overseas Private Investment Corporation, they provide political risk insurance. They can provide loan guarantees. They can provide private equity funds. It's the major arm of the U.S. government to support U.S. investors in Ukraine. It's been closed for years.
Why?
Now,
What
well,
was the reason?
they paid out a claim on a they paid out a claim for a guy who bought political risk insurance, and the Ukraine government just has not ever resolved that claim with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. But fortunately, in the last 3 weeks, Ambassador Taylor has been working very closely with the Prime Minister and with Grigori Nemyria, and 2 major actions have been taken by the Ukraine government. They got a resolution passed in the Cabinet of Ministers authorizing them to move forward on this. And they got a group set up to pick an implementer, somebody who will actually implement the program and bring it to conclusion. So, as Grigori mentioned last week here in Washington, 2 major steps have taken. There's some other few steps that have to be taken, and so they've accomplished more in the last 3 weeks than they have in the last 10 years in getting that moved forward, thanks to the Prime Minister and to Grigori and Ambassador Taylor. We think shortly they can put the rest of the pieces in place, and there's $500 million sitting in that pipeline, applications for support, and now companies need them more than ever. Bankers are requiring political risk insurance. They're requiring some participations. They're requiring support from Overseas Private Investment Corporation. So they need the OPIC more than ever. And we're very hopefully within the next 30 days, if everybody stays focused, we can get this thing, and then the United States government will be open then to support U.S. investors, and you can get some good news. Ukraine needs some good news right now. Markets are based on confidence and faith and trust. They need to be able to announce we're back on track with the IMF. We're going to be working with these other financial institutions. We've got the OPIC problem solved. And things are not as bad in Ukraine at all as some of the financial reporters are saying they are. They've been a little over the top. Ukraine needs to get back on the offensive in terms of stating Ukraine's not going to default. It's just not going to default. I can't think of any reputable economist that thinks they're going to default. The president has said they're not. The prime minister, Grigori, said it here last week. There's just no way they're going to default. So Ukraine's going to get through this crisis. They're not going to default. They're going to get back on track. Maybe it's going to take a year and a half, but they're going to get back to prosperity. The members of our council, I just got back from Ukraine, they're not leaving Ukraine.
Actually, that was part of the good news about your council.